In late 1944, the German army was on its last legs. As they were being forced back to their homeland, the fight finally reached Poland. After the Soviet Red Army was able to reach the outskirts of Warsaw, the Polish Home Army decided it was time to take a stand against their German occupiers. Starting on August 1st, 1944, the Poles of Warsaw began an uprising against the Nazis. Named the Warsaw Uprising, it lasted for roughly 60 days. Despite their heroic efforts to overthrow their invaders, the uprising led to the complete destruction of the city, along with mass displacement of civilians. It was eventually the Soviets who liberated Warsaw, creating a satellite nation. Poland as a satellite nation suffered much internal turmoil, which would last into the 1980s, ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the early 1930s, Poland and Germany were on shaky but somewhat friendly terms. Relations between Poland and Germany seemed to be stable. That is, however, until Germany reveals its true intentions. On August 23rd to the 24th, 1939, a secret meeting takes place between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. In this meeting, Hitler reveals to Stalin his intention to invade Poland. They then sign a pact. In this pact is an agreement to divvy up Eastern Europe, Poland included. Stalin agrees and Hitler prepares for war. On the eve of September 1st, 1939, Hitler stages an attack on a German radio tower, blaming the Poles. This attack, however, is nothing more than a ruse. Hitler uses this attack to formally declare Poland an aggressor and thus declare war. September 1st arrives, and the German Nazi army begins the invasion of Poland from the west. Storming in with over 1 million men, tanks, and aircraft, the Germans rapidly push into the country. The Poles meet their invaders with approximately 1 million men of their own forces. Despite the best efforts of the Polish army, the Germans are able to completely capture Poland in 18 days. The Soviets enter Poland on the 17th of September, and most of the Polish army falls shortly after. Immediately following the invasion, an underground resistance is formed. The Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, is formed from the remnants of Polish army officers. Among these officers is General Tadeusz Komorowski. Under the leadership of Komorowski and others, the Polish underground carries out numerous operations against the Nazis, including sabotage and other major operations. Later in the war, the Polish underground focuses less on the Nazis and more on the Soviet Union. Not only did the Soviet Union betray Poland multiple times throughout the war, they also committed atrocities against the Poles which easily rivaled those of the Nazis. In March of 1943, for example, German soldiers discovered a mass grave of Polish officers and civilians in Katyn Forest near Smolensk, Russia. It was discovered that the Poles were prisoners of war taken by the Soviets in 1939. The Soviets deemed these people a threat to the USSR and executed them. This struck a chord with the Polish people, not only because their fellow man was executed, but because they knew that they would suffer the same fate if and when the Soviets took control of Poland. It was then that the Home Army decided to take a stand against both of its enemies, the Nazis and the Soviets. The date is July 13, 1944, and Soviet troops have finally pushed into Poland. The Polish government in exile and the Home Army began planning an uprising in the capital of Warsaw. There are two main goals to this uprising. The first is to weaken and expel the German troops located in Warsaw. The second and most important reason is because of the Soviets. To the Home Army, it is of critical importance that Warsaw be liberated by Polish loyalists, rather than the Soviets, who would instill a communist government and most likely take loyalist prisoners. In late July, the government in exile named General Tadeusz Komorowski Commander-in-Chief of the Home Army forces. At the same time, Soviet forces are closing in on Warsaw. The Soviets reach the outskirts of the city, approximately 12.5 miles away, and General Komorowski decides it is time to begin the uprising. On the 1st of August, Komorowski issues orders for attacks to start at 5 p.m. that day. Despite a prepared enemy, the Poles are able to make a large amount of progress in the first few days, gaining control over several districts of the city. After several days, however, the plan is becoming flawed. By the 4th or 5th of August, Komorowski had planned to have Soviet support in the city. However, this was not the case. As soon as Soviet forces reached the suburbs of Warsaw, Joseph Stalin orders all troops to halt. In his words, the uprising is a reckless and terrible adventure, and does not wish to associate himself either directly or indirectly with the adventure in Warsaw. With Soviet aid seemingly not coming, The Home Army soldiers have to make do with scarce supply drops from American, British, and Polish forces. In the following weeks, the Poles are slowly but surely pushed back by the Germans, who have received reinforcements. Surrounded on all sides, the Home Army is forced to surrender, and on October 2nd, a ceasefire is announced. As the Home Army soldiers were initially running low on supplies, the British and Americans were eager to provide the partisans with airdrops. However, Stalin denies British and American planes a right to land on Soviet airstrips, meaning it is not possible for pilots to make consistent drops to the partisans. The lack of airdrops, combined with no Soviet support whatsoever, renders a successful uprising nearly impossible. Obviously, the Germans also played a major role. Unlike the Poles, Germans are able to receive reinforcements. By mid-September, when the fighting is most fierce, the Germans bring in fresh new troops to continue. During the uprising, German soldiers are ruthless to all Poles in the city. The Germans have a take-no-prisoners policy. It is to be assumed that any Polish civilian in the city supports the Home Army, and they are therefore executed on sight. In several reports, Home Army members also witnessed Polish citizens being used as human shields for German tanks and soldiers. One Home Army member states, "The tanks in Rynkova and Chiepla streets were moving along behind a crowd of civilians, who were being driven ahead to provide cover for the Germans. I gave the order to fire. Some of the civilians were left hit and left lying on the pavement. These actions lead to many more casualties than anyone had expected." Many bad things came directly after the end of the uprising. Those Home Army soldiers who survive are taken as prisoners of war, and most civilians are sent to Nazi concentration camps. The Germans then take the opportunity to loot the city. After Warsaw is scoured for valuables, the entire city is ordered to be destroyed. Soviet troops eventually arrive in the city, and further destruction ensues between the battle of the Soviets and the Nazis. It was eventually the Soviets who liberated Poland, and because Joseph Stalin disagrees with everything the partisans stand for, the existence of the Home Army is repressed, and the Warsaw Uprising is portrayed as a complete failure by a group of foolish partisans. The Soviets also greatly exaggerate their role in the liberation of Warsaw. During the uprising, media generally report on a day-to-day basis, and great sympathy is shown towards the Poles. Of course, the topic of Soviet aid comes up several times, but due to a lack of knowledge and Soviet deceptions, not much can be said. After the uprising, media is not generally concerned about reporting on it, as the continuing war provides other stories. Not many world leaders comment on the uprising. After the war, Poland is left as one of the most devastated nations of the war, with no less than 21% of the population being killed. A communist government is instated in the late 1940s, and the country becomes a satellite nation for the USSR. Because of this, details of what happened in Warsaw are suppressed even more. In Poland, even mentioning the Home Army is forbidden. Monuments are erected of Soviet troops, and the failures of the Home Army and the government in exile are greatly exaggerated. Criticism of the Red Army is strictly forbidden. During the Cold War, Poland suffers much internal turmoil. The first decade or so is spent turning Poland into a Soviet Socialist Republic. The mid-1960s sees a great economic downturn, with cut wages leading to strikes across the country. After this, social and economic stability is never truly achieved. Despite all this, Poland is one of the key players in the fall of communism. In the late 1980s, then Communist Prime Minister Czesław Kiszek announces his resignation, as to allow for the formation of a non-communist government. Tadeusz Mazowiecki is nominated for the office and becomes leader of the first non-communist government in the Eastern Bloc. Surprisingly, the Soviet Union has no objections. Under the new democratic government, which the Home Army had fought so hard to achieve, information about the Warsaw Uprising begins to surface, though it feels little interest at the time. However, after the fall of communism in 1991, interest peaks about the uprising. Documentaries are made, scholarly articles are published, and the world is finally aware of the heroism of the Red Army and their stand against their foes. Since then, the anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising has become a celebrated event in Poland. In the face of a ruthless, unbeatable foe and an ally of an ally, the bravery and dedication of the Home Army soldiers will be remembered for generations to come.